Welcome to Oh God What Now, the podcast where none of the hosts is standing down to run as an MP. Yet. We haven't hit the deadline, so who knows? I'm Dorian Lynskey. On today's show, Rishi Sunak is running the most incompetent campaign in living memory. Might his Mr. Bean routine allow the Tories to escape a reckoning for the last 14 years of pain? Then, Labour's treatment of Diane Abbott has caused outrage. Jeremy Corbyn is running against his former party in Islington North, and Central Office is overruling constituency parties to impose candidates. Is Starmer storing up trouble on the left? And in the extra bit for supporters, private schools are having conniptions about Labour's proposed VAT on fees. Why do private schools take up so much space in British politics? Let's meet today's fun-sized panel. First, it's Westminster editor of The Lead, Zoe Grünewald. Hi, Zoe.
Hello.
You've written in The Lead that the Tories hate young people and have for 14 years. We've talked many times about their youth problem, i.e. the youth don't like them. Have they given up even trying, as this latest raft of policy suggests?
I think they have. And I think at this point, that's because they're all about damage limitation. So I just think there's no doubt in their mind that they're not going to close the poll lead with Labour. There's no point fighting Labour face to face. So instead, they're trying to win back all those voters that might split off to reform. So these are the older, the whiter, tend to be less university educated, tend to be slightly more drawn in by cultural arguments, and slightly more drawn in by the generational warfare argument that the Tories keep waging. And so I think they are now basing their campaign on whatever they can do to stop those voters from going to reform. So trying to kind of beat them at their own game. So we've seen, obviously, national service was the huge kind of lightning rod this week. We've also had their pensions triple lock plus. And today we've had their clamp down on Mickey Mouse degrees. I mean, it's a lot of policies that basically imply that they don't think the youth of today are pulling their weight, doing the right thing, and that they're on the side of pensioners. And the point I make in my piece is actually this didn't start with national service. If you look at the Tories' track record, all their policies have added up to basically a whole lot of disdain for young people, from allowing the rental market to get extremely inflated and lock people out of it, to underfunding youth services, to letting higher education run into a crisis. They've never really been a party for young people, but now they're really leading into that, basically.
Although a Telegraph columnist pointed out that it was high time that the young repaid their debt to society for all their fun times during lockdown.
Yeah, it's a really strange angle. Did you see they had to rehead it, I think maybe 3 or 4 times, because clearly they just realised the argument wasn't quite working out the way they thought it would be perceived. I mean, the idea that young people were already making a ton of sacrifices, if you look at all those things I pointed out before, where money was being prioritised and money was being spent compared to where young people really desperately needed it to go. We've all just forgotten about the immense sacrifice that young people made during lockdown. I mean, now we're seeing in younger children the developmental problems it's had, the mental health problems it's had. And then for, younger adults who went to university and lost 2 years of their university life or 2 years of their time coming out of school and finally becoming adults. I mean, it's priceless. And already the Telegraph columnists are pretending that they just got an easy time of it.
But the snowflake myth never dies, despite difficulties in whether that be in job market or housing, or, like you said, being hit, particularly losing a big chunk of their youth to the pandemic. And yet the idea that they're all kind of incredibly pampered and on their phones, which is true, they are always on their phones, sort of sticks.
Yeah, absolutely.
No wonder they're angry.
And I think, all the solutions that Rishi Sunak has posed, they're all punitive measures. So, banning smartphones, banning cigarettes, national service, maths to 18. I mean, that's one of the most horrific things I think you can do to young people, make them study maths until the age of 18.
You can't even smoke your way through it.
I know, it's just horrendous. It's like, how about a bit more carrot and a bit less stick?
Next up, Associate Political Editor of The New Statesman, Rachel Cunliffe. Hi, Rachel.
Hello, I quite like doing maths up to 18. But that's just me.
That's just, I don't think it is just you.
Well, we can call it
not me.
Rachel's Law. I mean, that's like your legacy.
I think everyone should have to do it. I don't think that the worst thing you can do to a teenager is make them do maths to 18. I think it's probably drag them out on a wet weekend once a month and make them pick up rubbish because people who have houses that they'll never be able to buy think they're not tough enough. That's what I think is the worst thing you can do.
That is worse than maths, it's true. You recently interviewed the independent candidate running against Liz Truss in southwest Norfolk.
I did.
Who seemed fascinating.
He was so interesting and so lovely. This is a guy called James Bagg. He is 71. If elected, he would be the oldest first-time MP. He's almost certainly not going to get elected, but he was sort of a lifelong Conservative. He was a member of the local Conservative Association. He spoke out against Liz Truss being imposed on South West Norfolk as the Conservative candidate in 2009, said she wasn't local, and said the constituency deserved somebody who actually cared about the constituency rather than just somebody wanting a safe seat so they could go off and make their name in Westminster. And from his perspective, he's been proved right. So I went to chat to him thinking he was going to be a kind of more conservative than the Conservatives type figure. And in a way, he was. He really comes across as a Conservative. But he used all these words that you don't hear Conservatives using, like, you know, paying back to society and civic duty. And he volunteered for Citizens Advice for a while to get a sense of sort of on the front line what people are dealing with. And he is the chairman of various local youth projects. And he's very upset that Liz Truss has never been to the youth projects in his area. And he's very upset that he doesn't feel that she's really got into the nitty gritty of how the various NHS care boards talk to the local council, talk to the charity. So all of this stuff that's not particularly glitzy, you wouldn't put it on a policy flyer, but it's actually really important for people's day-to-day lives. He's kind of on top of that, so he's running against her.
I mean, will that make it harder for one of the parties to get rid of her, or is her seat so disgustingly safe that it really wouldn't matter?
So she has one of the safest Conservative seats. She's got a majority of 26,000. His perspective is Labour can't win in that seat because it's such a Conservative seat.
I've been to Downham Market where you interviewed him.
Yeah.
That's a very, very Tory spot.
It's a very, very Tory area, isn't it? But he said if half the people who voted Conservative last time don't like Liz Truss and they vote for him instead as the alternative, then he's got a shot. And he says he's spoken to people who are saying, I've voted Conservative my whole life, but I just can't back them this time round. And I did try and speak to people in Downham Market about how they felt about politics in general. To be honest, most of them hadn't heard of him and his campaign, which was quite sad. But they had heard of Liz Truss, and the level of disgust for her book, her time on the American circuit, the way she crashed the economy, according to them, the fact that she wasn't there and she wasn't local and they just felt completely abandoned by her. There's a lot of resentment towards her personally. So does he have a shot? I mean, anyone's got a shot in politics.
It would be
right?
fun if she lost her seat, really, mainly because people personally disliked her her actions.
It would also be fun because so many of the big name Conservatives who people might have been looking forward to seeing them lose their seat on election night, they're standing down anyway, so we're not going to get those Portillo moments. So I think Liz Truss would be the ultimate Portillo moment, and maybe this guy, James Bagg, could make it happen.
Portillo Plus. It'd be amazing. Let's begin. Rishi Sunak is proving to be the most politically inept Tory PM of recent times, and that's saying something. Theresa May's 2017 campaign looks like a well-oiled machine by comparison. Could his majestic incompetence give the Tories an easy scapegoat for defeat and prevent them from facing up to the party's deeper failures? Rachel, you are the Tory whisperer. as a journalist. Net satisfaction in Sunak is now at the joint worst levels in the history of Ipsos, equivalent to John Major in 94 and Jeremy Corbyn in 2019, the absolute depths. Does he have any political skills at all?
He's good at looking at spreadsheets.
That's good.
And there's a long pause and silence there. No, I think that's it, is that he is the kind of politician who looks at spreadsheets and looks at focus groups. And even before we get into the election campaign, I've spoken to ministers and aides who found it very frustrating when he was Prime Minister governing, because they'd have an idea and they'd send him a kind of 2-page memo and he'd say, come back and answer these 50 questions and send me a 40-page memo. So he was sort of so determined to be on top of all of the detail, which in a way is a good thing in some cases, but so invested in the detail that he was completely paralysed and they felt like they couldn't get anything done. I think it's the opposite of the Boris Johnson attitude to governance, which was it will be all right in the end somehow. I mean, Rishi Sunak does put the hours in, and nobody has ever raised any doubts about how many children he has. Nobody has ever raised any doubts about who paid for his wallpaper. So come on, let's put some ticks in the Rishi Sunak column.
Because at one point, the idea was that his personal brand would lift the party, not panning out. Did something big change, or was that always a delusion? I mean, the usual reading that we have of Sunak is that basically that his popularity was based on giving people furlough.
Yeah.
And really on nothing else. I mean, was there a point at which that actually seemed viable, or was there a weird sort of delusion around it?
I think both. It was viable and it was a delusion, because there was a period where his personal poll ratings were significantly higher than those of the party. And also the contrast between his manner and his style of governance and his... I mean, you always knew he was on top of the detail, right? And during the tail end of the Boris Johnson era, that started to look really, really important. So I can see how it would have looked. You know, the grass is always greener. Hang on, you've got somebody who is prepared to put the work in and who we can trust to be on top of the detail. We haven't had that. It's all going wrong for us. Let's give it a go. I think a couple of things went wrong with that. One is that Rishi Sunak himself bought into his higher popularity ratings. And I know some of the people who worked on his comms team. And one of the questions I'm always asking them is, did nobody ever sit him down and go, yes, you come across well on TV, yes, you've done your homework, well done, but these poll ratings, they're not actually about you, they're about the free money. And I think if someone had had that very frank conversation with him early on, that would have been helpful. The other thing is the type of insight into Rishi Sunak as a politician we got during COVID was very one-sided. It was press conferences, there's COVID press conferences. People weren't asking more political questions because we were all just in a panic and we wanted to know what the government was doing about various things. And again, Boris Johnson got ill, cabinet in freefall, all the rest of it. We didn't see Sunak as a campaigner really until he was going for the Tory leadership against Liz Truss in summer 2022. And let's not forget, that's a campaign that he lost. So Sunak, under the pressure of having to explain himself and really sell himself, he's not very good at it. He gets very tetchy. He snaps at journalists. He snaps at members of the public. He snapped at Liz Truss in a way that I think people watching those debates in 2022 were a bit taken aback by the way he came across. He has this, well, I know better than you sort of smug attitude, which he's never had to work on because he's never been in a high-profile campaign before. And now he's on the general election trail and he cannot understand why it keeps going wrong. And that frustration that he clearly feels with journalists, but also with the public, that comes through in every piece of media that he does.
Oh, I almost feel bad for him.
Really?
It's a big almost. It's a polite almost. So one narrative that the Tories are telling is fuck the young. Is there another so far? Like the story they're telling? Because Labour's story is quite easy. It's like, it's change. We've changed. The country needs change. Change. What are the Tories trying to say about the country?
I think it's better the devil you know, basically. So it's stick with me. The plan is working, which I hate that phrase because I don't think the public can tell you what the plan is.
No idea.
They've never really laid out what the plan is. So to say the plan is working, I actually think feeds into a little bit of what Rachel was saying, which is this kind of smug attitude that comes across, which is, don't worry about it. We've got it under control. We're the big politicians in the grey suits and we know what we're doing. And I think the public don't buy that because after the last few years, they don't really trust the Tory party anymore. And they don't trust some of the Tory party's great ideas, i.e. Liz Truss's mini budget. So he's basically saying the plan is working, stick with us. I think that's problematic. And unfortunately, their other attack line is that Keir Starmer doesn't have a plan. And although, I mean, we'll get into Keir Starmer's campaign so far a little bit more, I think that people feel that Keir Starmer either has more of a plan or just the same amount of plan as Rishi Sunak. I don't think it's a successful attack line. I think people don't really know what the two major policies are from either party, but they trust Keir Starmer a little bit more because he doesn't have 14 years of failure to point to. So, yeah, I think basically he's just saying, you're better with us than you are with Labour, but I think people tend to disagree and they need a bit more than that.
And when we're trying to anatomise this campaign so far, how big an error was the timing of the election? Has that made things significantly worse, or do you feel that even if it was in the autumn or, God forbid, January 25, you'd sort of have the same problems vis-a-vis what's the plan and so on.
I think it's really difficult to know because there are loads of things that could have gone wrong over the summer, right? So you could have had Rwanda flights crashing and burning, held up in court. You could have had far more small boat crossings. You could have more people remortgaging. You could have Nigel Farage announcing his candidacy. There were all more Tory sleaze because that just seemed to happen, bi-monthly. But then there's also the list of things that could have gone better. So the economy could have continued to improve to the point where people maybe started feeling it. Junior doctor strike could have been resolved. Labour could have unravelled. So the balance is, you can't know what would have been better. But personally, I think Sunak made a mistake. If he wasn't going to leave it till the last moment, he should have gone in May, or he should have gone before local elections, because he would have had far more manpower. There wouldn't have been all those lost Conservative councillors. He wouldn't have lost the mayor of West Midlands, and you'd be able to unite behind the fact that he just got Rwanda through. That was his big flagship policy. I think if there was a time to have called an early election, early in inverted commas, it probably would have been then. Basically, once he didn't call it in May, I think it really was anyone's guess as to when he would. And I think who's to know whether it will get better or not.
But the other thing that he did in not going in May was his office sent a very clear signal to local associations, to candidates, to councillors. OK, we did the May campaign. Come back after the summer, regroup, take a break or whatever. And they were caught completely off guard. And it's been a week, and I am still getting furious texts from people in the various wings of the Tory ecosystem saying we are exhausted. We didn't know that this was coming. We used all our energy on May. We don't have our candidates sorted out because we were told that we didn't need to. We don't have our campaign finances sorted out because we thought that we had longer. How could you do this to people who are meant to be on your side? And there is a lot of ill will still in that group, and just a real lack of energy. I think a lot of them, I can say this on this podcast, can't I? A lot of them have just gone, fuck it then. And that is just the kind of vibe. An election campaign is 6 weeks and it's really exhausting. You need people who want to go out and campaign for you.
Our main asset as a podcast is that you can say fuck it.
I can say fuck it.
Because it does seem like there is a smell of decay around the whole operation, because you've got, I think, 129 MPs, this may have changed since then, have announced they're standing down, including some of those fun killers like Michael Gove and Andrea Leadsom, who we will not get to see looking sad in a leisure centre. And then weird stuff like Lucy Allen suspended for backing reform, Steve Baker, who fucked off on holiday after trashing the National Service policy.
Good for him.
And he was like, not my problem.
I spoke to Steve Baker in the Politics Live studio the day after the election was called, and I said he cancelled any holidays, and he just looked at me and he went, between you and me, I'm still going. I'm going catamaran sailing. And I just thought, good for you, Steve.
But it does give the impression that it's sort of falling to bits, that a lot of Tories don't think they're going to win, don't particularly want to win. I don't remember exactly what the vibe was in 97. Because I wasn't following it that closely. But it does seem very unusual. There's almost a sense that his own sort of troops, someone's going to frag him, like in Vietnam.
I think there's also anger among those who wanted to replace him but didn't act before, because they'd got rid of Boris Johnson and had Liz Truss. They'd got rid of Liz Truss and had Rishi Sunak. And even among some people who were very, very critical of him, there was a sense of, OK, he's not the guy that we would have wanted, but we can't switch leader again. Let's just do the best that we can. And as Zoe said, follow the plan. And to then have that thrown back in their face because he essentially gave up and decided to call the election. You've got people going, if you didn't want to do it, there would have been other people who would have not won the election, but would have been able to do a little bit better. Why was your ego so big that you couldn't give someone else the chance? So there's that. There's also the fact that the blame game, I think, has been going on really for the last 6 months. People trying to get their narratives in early in the party. This brings me to the big question. So I noticed a few commentators separately suggesting that Sunak is being so useless that the Tories will be able to pin defeat on him alone, not have to deal with the legacy of the previous four. Is that your impression? Is those sort of narratives that are building, that it's not the entire Tory party that has failed, it's this clown? Well, I spoke to somebody who's been around in the Conservative Party for many, many decades about this before the election was called. And he said, look, people always want to throw around blame after the election. We're going to lose badly. Sunak will say it's the fault of Boris Johnson and Liz Truss. Boris Johnson will say it's Rishi Sunak's fault. Liz Truss will say it's the deep state, and everyone will blame David Cameron. That's just what happens. And I think that is certainly one narrative, that Sunak was uniquely bad, uniquely incompetent, and that was the problem. You will also, though, get Sunak supporters or people who are a bit more sympathetic who say, look at the inheritance he got from Liz Truss. Look at what the polls were doing under Boris Johnson. You know, it was a real hospital pass. He did the best that he possibly could. And one of Sunak's weaknesses, I think, is he didn't do a good enough job early on of making that case, of saying we had someone who was batshit insane before. I like that I can say that on this podcast. I did the best I could. And the attempt to placate Liz Truss fans early on is what prevented him from getting his own narratives out there early.
You should come in and just gone, what was that all about, guys? That was crazy.
Because that was part of his appeal. His appeal was he was a grown-up in a suit who'd come from management.
Very shiny shoes.
And was going to come in and just be the grown-up. And he should have lent into that. You know, he should have said, OK, the economy's a mess. I know that. It's partly the fault of these people who came before me. I know trust is broken. I mean, he's never really lent on the fact that Boris Johnson really destroyed a lot of the trust in the Conservative Party. And it's completely because the party's so divided. You know, you've still got such a big caucus of bring back Boris Johnson. In fact, they're not even bring back Boris Johnson there. We should never, ever have got rid of Boris Johnson. You know, they still beat that drum.
I've read The Plot by Nadine Dorries, so I know all about this.
Exactly. And, you know, he was so scared of putting a foot wrong and upsetting this influential part of his party that he's just pretended it hasn't
Right, so the whole point of him, his only hope really was like turning the page. So it's like, so he didn't distance himself from the last two. So, you know, what can he do? You can't be the change candidate. I'm intrigued. So that Labour is silent on Brexit, to the annoyance of listeners, but it is understandable. It's just like, let's not kick that off again. But the Tories avoiding it, is that proof positive that it has failed as a project? Because it's the project that sucks in all five. These are five prime ministers with very different personalities, very different agendas. The one thing that I know that, you know, obviously Cameron didn't want to leave, but he called the fucking referendum. So they're all involved somehow, and that they don't want to talk about it.
Yeah, I think so. I think there is a real there's almost like a conspiracy of silence around it. And I think Labour are talking about it more and more, and they're sort of flexing their muscles a little bit on it. You can see that David Lammy's being a bit more public about speaking to the French and speaking to EU counterparts. But the Conservatives are just kind of ignoring it. And when you get challenged on it on in the media, they say, well, that's because certain things weren't done right, and that's because, you know, there's still red tape there, and it's still the EU trying to fuck with us. But, you know, I think it's absolutely the case that they probably know that it can't be ignored forever. And, you know, I was talking to a Tory peer the other day, actually, who was saying that they're part of the Bring Back Boris crew. And they were saying, actually, the whole reason they got rid of Boris was because of Brexit. It wasn't because of Partygate. It was because there is a whole cohort of the Conservative Party who never wanted to leave the EU and would never forgive Boris Johnson for the hard Brexit. So the party itself seems completely divided over Brexit still. It's just this whole mess that, you know, one day is going to have to come out in the wash. But at the minute, I think they'd rather not talk about, because it's really hard to talk about without admitting that there are lots of things that the UK government did wrong.
So I want to ask both of you about what's going on behind the scenes of this campaign. So I want to start with you, because I think you've been looking into Isaac Levido, the key strategist, Linton Crosby protege, who was also involved in the 2019 campaign, which went rather better. What's his deal, and why is it not working this time?
So I was briefly commissioned to write a profile of Isaac Levido. And it was giving me the biggest headache because this man does not want to be profiled. He's very low key. He doesn't really he's given a couple of interviews, but not many. He doesn't really do a lot of public stuff. And luckily, they decommissioned me and commissioned me for something else, which I was very grateful for because it was stressing me out.
Nothing better.
Yeah. But yes, he's Australian. He's done consultancy work in Washington. He's done consultancy work in Australia. He worked on the Liberal Party's campaign in Australia in 2018, which was a bit of a surprise victory. As you say, he's very tied to Linton Crosby. So he's kind of from that culture war school of thought, so that kind of attack version of the election strategy. But Levido believes that voters are very perceptive and will not just fall for culture war rhetoric without it being directly tied to their lived experience. So he's said to be behind some of the net zero U-turn stuff because he saw there was a link between the culture war there and the fact that people felt they were paying for it, from their own pockets. So he's fairly well liked. He's, keeps himself to himself.
Not a prick. I saw in one profile of him.
I saw that as well.
And I just thought, is that the best quote you've got about him?
Yeah. And he was very trusted by Sunak, and I think he still is. He's the one who always rallies the MPs when they start kind of losing faith in the party to win.
Steep but narrow. That's his line, isn't it? Steep but narrow path to victory.
That's right. Yeah.
I'm not sure if he's still saying that.
Deploying the so-called 80-20 strategy, which is to defend 80 seats and gain 20. He apparently, though, was against the early election, so the rumours go, telling MPs recently as mid-May that longer was needed to change voters' minds. So although he has been very much trusted in the Sunak camp, that it's interesting that Sunak would have gone kind of directly against his advice here.
Yeah, it's not great, I suppose, if you overrule your top strategist. Rachel, there are other people. There was a big Guardian piece profiling all the kind of movers and shakers in the Sunak camp, many of whom I've never heard of. So it was Liam Booth-Smith, Ellen Shawcross, Narissa Chesterfield.
I used to go for drinks with Narissa Chesterfield. She's lovely.
James Forsyth, I have heard of him. Are any of these, just from your observation over the last week, do you see their fingerprints on this? Do you see any of them being kind of, really sort of important players at the moment?
I think the most important is James Forsyth, who's the one who you've heard of. But I don't think he's important because you've heard of him. He's important because...
I would hope there are other criteria other than Dorian's heard of him.
I think one of the things that is going wrong on this campaign is they have a candidate who won't really listen to anyone else, who believes wholeheartedly in his own ability, even when all of the evidence is to the contrary. And one of the few people who Rishi Sunak does listen to is James Forsyth, who is his long-term friend. I can never remember which way around. One of them was best man at the other's wedding, and the other one is godfather to the other's children.
Yeah.
I can never remember that either.
But they're pretty close. And I think James Forsyth has been Rishi's cheerleader actually through much of his frontline political career. And a lot of those moments when something has gone wrong and you've gone, why would he do this? Why would he make that call? Doesn't he realise how badly it's going? I've had this from Conservative MPs. The reason he doesn't realise how badly it's going is because he calls up James and says, am I really that rubbish? And James goes, no, you're great.
May, no.
And I think psychologically that has had an impact. I'm not saying that it's all James Forsyth's fault. And I think one of the things that you have to be better at if you want to be in frontline politics is listening to advice and not just the advice that you want to hear. But I think that has reinforced Sunak's sense of invincibility. The other thing about a lot of the people on that list is that they're just really young. Like they're my age or younger. Like Rishi Sunak's director of strategy is 2 years younger than me. And again, is somebody who is a really nice guy to have a drink with in a pub. But you're like, how are you director of strategy? Just because that's a huge job for someone that young to have. And I think it was his Sunak's comms guy for a really long time is Cass Horowitz, who is the son of the author Anthony Horowitz, who's a glitzy PR guy. All of these people, I think, have their talents, have their skills, but they don't have the experience of something going wrong. And I think to run an election campaign,
they're getting that now.
you need people who have worked on campaigns where the shit has hit the fan and they have had to deal with the consequence of it. If everything has always gone smoothly, you put your campaign together, you tick the right box, you call the right people, you put the right literature out, you get a result, you don't have that experience to fall back on.
And finally, quickly, Henry Hill of Conservative Home wrote a good piece in The Guardian saying that it's really not helpful to say that the Tories are going to turn right in defeat, because they are, but which kind of right? It involves various tough decisions. And of course, there's huge clashes, that we've talked before about, the popcons and the natcons. These are really quite different right-wing propositions. Is that sort of all to play for, do you think? That it depends on the blame game, that it's not really obvious which of these will be the new direction? Yeah,
none of them know. It depends a lot on the makeup, on who is left. I remember speaking to somebody who was associated with the New Conservatives, who was trying very earnestly to explain to me how they were actually the centre of the party, because, they believed in community and funding public services, just fewer immigrants and more women having children rather than getting degrees, and how that was the centre, or how that was closer to where the median British voter was than, for example, neoliberals who are really into free trade and individualism and go off and do what you want but have low taxes. And I think there is something in that, how the British public are quite inconsistent. But yeah, it is all to play for. I don't think there's a front runner anymore. And I think this campaign could make or break quite a lot of the people who would like to be the next Tory leader.
Now, time for some questions from our Patreon backers in But Your Emails. If you support us on Patreon, you too could submit a question to the panel. During the election, we're going to see if we can do more than one question, which is very ambitious. This is from Daniel Block. With heavy hitters already swerving potential humiliation by standing down now, such as Michael Gove, do you think their seats are more or less vulnerable without them? Would a fresh, unknown face be more palatable to the voters, or do the well-known names pull in more local votes than national polling on average? I don't really know the answer to this, so
That's really interesting, because there are some voters who really know their local MP and really like their local MP, or really dislike their local MP, but when they go to the polling booth, they attach quite a lot of what they vote for to whether they think their local MP has done a good thing for their constituency. So when I went to university in Sheffield, I was Sheffield Hallam, and Nick Clegg was the MP there, and people voted for him because they really liked him round there. He had, good popularity. He was well known. Obviously, it was a student area. Post 2012, obviously, the vote declined and you got a different MP. But there was quite a lot attached to his name and his presence. But the thing I find really interesting about this question is, I actually think in this election we might see a renewed focus in independent candidates. When I was in Rochdale and I was vox popping, there was a lot of people talking about the independent candidate there, David Tully. And obviously he wasn't running for a particular party. He wasn't running for the Conservatives. He was running as an independent. But people really liked that he was Rochdalian born and bred. They really liked that he was talking about local issues like he knew them. And I think there's something there for parties to tap into, that if they try and find people who are really local and really care about the area and know people and know the local pubs and know the local football team, people really like that, especially in areas that feel really separated from the Westminster bubble. And, we were just talking about Liz Truss and that
James Bagg, classic local campaign.
Exactly. I think there's a real, especially for those constituencies where they feel like MPs have been parachuted in, they have their own political ambitions, they don't care about their constituency. I think there could be a real push for an MP, independent or attached to a party, who genuinely seems to care about the local area. And, people have lost quite a lot of trust in Westminster politics. That push for something that, where people actually are going to Westminster and they are representing their constituents' interests. I mean, it sounds revolutionary. For some people, it really feels like they don't do that anymore.
A local MP, you say?
Yeah, can you believe? Yeah. So, you could say that the Tories' brand is just so toxic now that even if you put someone in like that, people would not be willing to vote for them. But I think, newer, fresh faces who could come in and say, listen, I know the party has done all these things, but here's everything I'm going to do for your constituency as your Tory MP, could be a real appeal for some people.
I also think there are Tory MPs who are standing down who are not high-profile names, but who are really well-liked as Conservative MPs, and those seats now hang in the balance. So I'm thinking about Robert Halfon in Harlow, who's standing down. He was a 2010 MP, really, really well-liked. That was a seat that on the swing that Labour looks likely to get is in the balance, but with him standing, people thought he'd probably hold it. Now, not so much. My parents are in Finchley and Golders Green, which was held by Mike Freer, who is standing down in part because of the threats that he and his gay partner have received for being an MP. He's the one whose office got suffered an arson attack, and. Speaking, I have no way of knowing which way my mum is going to vote, but she really liked him as a local MP who did a lot of constituency work and was always responding to letters and queries. And I think that seat is more likely to swing Labour now because of that. So they're losing some really decent people as well who, again, don't want to be associated with the Tory brand.
Well, side note, I suppose, we forget that there are a lot of reasons why people stand down. And obviously with the Tory side, we just think, because they know they're going to lose and it's rats fleeing the sinking ship. There's actually been quite a few people, Labour MPs, standing down, and a lot of the reasons they've given is just like, I've got 2 young kids and this job is a nightmare. Or like you said, that one, fear for safety or whatever. So it's not always like political calculation, because you think that no Labour MP would stand down on the verge of power, but sometimes people just don't want to do the job. Next is from Ella Humphreys. This is inspired by Nadine Dorries. And,
author of the plot.
A conspiratorially minded lady who observed that the timing of the election aligns with the new California school term. So if Rishi Sunak retains his seat but loses the election, what would be the mechanism for him to leave as a freshly re-elected MP for the new parliament, if that is indeed what he wants to do and he's been lying to us? Would he just resign and trigger an immediate by-election, or do you think that he's going to sort of like hang around for a reasonable period of time?
Well, the mechanism for him to leave is exactly that, for him to resign and we have a by-election a couple of weeks later. I don't think
optics bad.
He'll do that. I think at that point, does he care? I mean, maybe he does, but I think the optics at that point for Rishi Sunak are not the issue. The other thing that he is more likely to do is stay on like David Cameron did for a bit and just melt into the background, and whether you'd ever see him in Parliament or not is kind of not really the point. He'd just sort of blend into the back. I can't see him becoming a Theresa May-like figure. I mean, she has done a fantastic job of rehabilitating her reputation on the backbenches by just being there every single week asking really tough questions of her own government. And I think it would be great if more former leaders and former cabinet ministers did choose to stay on the backbenches. But I can't see Rishi Sunak doing that. I've heard the school term thing from a couple of people. I just sort of think that if you're putting your kids into the best private school in California, which they will be, does it matter if they start a few months late?
I think you can just walk in on the last day of term if you.
I mean, just your dad was Prime Minister.
Yeah.
Buy everyone in the class a pony and they'll all love you.
Well, readers of the plot may be aware that Nadine is prone to observing two quite separate events and tying some red thread between them.
But I think that the real banter option, and this is something that a Conservative strategist mentioned to me today, is he might lose his seat. No, I don't think he will lose his seat. I think that would be pretty seismic. But the York and North Yorkshire mayoral race went against him. That was in his backyard. We just don't know what's going to happen. But wouldn't that be hilarious? That would be a bigger Portillo moment than Liz Truss.
Because Lib Dem leaders have lost their seats.
Joe Swinson, famously.
But prime ministers? I mean, it probably has happened, but it's not.
I don't know of any example of a prime minister losing their seat in an election. No.
We need like a kind of little AI John Curtis in the corner, don't we?
To correct us.
Well, actually, in 1876. Next up, Jeremy Corbyn says he will stand against Labour as an independent candidate in Islington North, the constituency he's represented since 1983, and he has a strong chance of winning. And Diane Abbott has been given the whip back, but there is some confusion over whether she would be allowed to wants to stand in Hackney North and Stoke Newington, causing outrage over the handling of her suspension and the treatment of Britain's first black woman MP. So this is the first sort of real negative story of Labour's campaign, and maybe the most confusing, because I had to keep rewriting the intro. And even then, you can see I was like...
it may be out of date by now.
Hedging my bets on what... It's been pretty chaotic. I do remember why she was suspended last year over this letter she wrote to The Observer, which made some very rum claims about different kinds of racism. What has blown up this week?
Okay, so we know about the original reason for the suspension. She wrote a letter in The Observer saying that Jewish, Irish and traveller people do not face racism in inverted commas all their lives. She was suspended. There's been an ongoing investigation. On Tuesday of this week, it was revealed that her suspension had been lifted. It was then briefed to The Times that evening that she would not be allowed to stand again as an MP in Hackney for the Labour Party. Labour had not denied the reports, but asked about Diane's claim that she had been barred at a campaign visit in Worcester later on Wednesday. Sir Keir Starmer said, "No, that's not true. No decision has been taken to bar Diane Abbott." It's not quite clear if his comments are a statement of technical fact or a shift in the direction of travel. He was quite careful with his wording. It's not really clear if he's saying no decision has been made yet or that's just not true at all and the briefing was nonsense.
Diane Abbott then tweeted that she was annoyed that people were suggesting she'd been barred.
Yeah.
So everybody with an actual name and a face was saying, no, she hasn't been.
But somebody had briefed
that she had been.
Which was authoritative enough that they, were happy to print it. So basically what's going on is kind of classic Labour, I don't want to say classic Labour chaos, but a bit of Labour factionalism where you have the inner workings of the party trying to put something out there to either force a decision or make something happen. So some of the school of thought is that this was briefed out in order to ensure that Diane Abbott would not stand again. The idea that they gave her the whip back, they were under quite a lot of pressure to do so. The investigation had been going on for ages.
And it had actually concluded months ago.
Yeah, and then there was talk that she'd wanted to kind of orchestrate her own dignified exit from politics, and now this briefing has actually made it very messy and chaotic and again looked like a lot of people piling on Diane Abbott. So it's basically become it's extended this row over Diane Abbott, which has been going on for a year now, keeps rearing its head just at a time where Labour are trying to get their message out. Today they were trying to talk about the NHS and their plans to sort out the health service, and it's just been completely overshadowed by the Diane Abbott.
Because I understand, the way I understand it is that the sort of the plan, like what they wanted was this sort of dignified retirement. She's probably going to retire, and then she was going to retire as a Labour MP, not a suspended independent. And then this anonymous briefing kind of messes it all up. And as somebody pointed out, the anonymous briefing was what caused a lot of the problems with the Green New Deal and kind of pushed Starmer around. What is going on discipline-wise? Because if you are on the left and you step out of line, it's like the shit hammer comes down. And yet you've got a lot of these sort of factional people who seem to be to Starmer's right. Just all you have to do is speak to the Times or whoever, and then it just seems that there's this whole drama. Like, is there a problem with just a discipline problem with people opening their mouths?
I think there's a lot of, Labour is a broad church. The Conservatives are too, but they seem to row quite a lot more kind of aggressively and openly than the Conservatives tend to. And what you've got here is a kind of classic case of the sort of the centre, as in the kind of leadership centre of the Labour Party being sort of more towards the right, more moderate, and then you have it kind of cracking down quite harshly on these sort of the left-wing factions of the party. And I think this is, you say it is like the Green New Deal. You get these briefings and counter briefings because you get certain factions of the party putting out that something's about to be crushed and then another faction denying it. And the truth is there's probably some ongoing discussions, but by briefing out there, people are trying to hurry things on or in some cases putting out there so someone senior will come back and deny it. It's quite a lot of sort of underhand politics. But I think the thing about the Diane Abbott thing is it has really made a lot of people feel aggrieved for quite a few reasons. I mean, the first is that Diane Abbott, she's really long-standing female black MP, very, very well respected for her role, for all that she's achieved. And a lot of people felt that the long suspension and the long investigation were unfair and unjustified considering the work she'd done. She'd undergone her anti-Semitism training, which was part of the agreement for her to get the whip back, and people felt like it was kind of unnecessarily and slightly humiliatingly dragged on. The other is that MPs are just annoyed that this has become a huge row now at this point in the campaign, that it's completely overshadowed part of their messaging. Rishi Sunak has been talking about national service for 4 days. Everybody's talking about it. Whether you like it or not, that's a policy that's out there that people will talk about. I don't think Labour have anything to the same extent that has come out yet that they can talk about. And the other thing, which Stephen Bush actually pointed out on Twitter, is that this is adding to this thing that's been rumbling around Westminster for a while now and people are talking about, which is that some people see Lotto, the leadership of the Labour Party, as a bit of a boys' club, where there are some male figures in the centre of the party who are left to be unchecked, who are briefing, counter-briefing, and there's this sort of power struggle where everybody's just kind of piling in, and often, women are left out of conversations or become the target of this kind of behaviour. So even though these things, I don't know if they're necessary, this incident may well have all kind of blown over or been in some way remedied by the time that this episode comes out, it's upset a lot of voters. Whether it will move the dial on Labour's lead, I don't know. I doubt it will move it if it does that much. But the problem for Labour is that these things, when they keep coming up, they become issues when you get into power, especially if you get into power with a large majority. MPs who previously held it together to get elected, now feel emboldened to start speaking quite publicly and quite angrily about the leadership of the party.
So, Rachel, it was clear that what she did, I think, did merit a suspension for some period.
Yeah, I was pretty shocked by that.
I remember being really quite horrified by it. But it'd been a very long time. There's been obviously a lot of confusion. Is she ultimately a casualty of this determination to prove that Labour has buried Corbynism? That, like Corbyn himself, who we will come on to, there's almost sort of a living reminder of this sort of failure and things that scared people away from Labour, and that there is clearly another political justification on top of the original offence.
So I think there are two reasons why people close to Keir Starmer did not want Diane Abbott to stand as a Labour candidate in this election. The first one is, for all that she has been a trailblazer and is very well respected, she is considered by some to be a bit of a liability. I think that letter that she wrote to The Observer shows the risks, that she is somebody who says things sometimes that she shouldn't, and that was on anti-Semitism and different forms of racism. There are other comments that she has made in regards to Israel and Gaza. She's not...
Ukraine and China also, some pretty rum stuff.
Yeah, she's not always the best at choosing her words with care. And what people on the Labour campaign did not want was for her to be running as a candidate, to be asked something by a journalist, to say something, and then suddenly that's the story. Every member of Labour's front team suddenly gets asked, well, Diane Abbott has said this. Do you agree with this? No. So why is she standing as a Labour candidate? Yeah. They wanted to avoid that. The other thing they wanted, which is the point that you were alluding to, is to draw as much distance as possible between the Jeremy Corbyn era of Labour and now, because the attack line that Rishi Sunak keeps using, and other Conservatives as well, is you can't trust Keir Starmer because 5 years ago he wanted to make Jeremy Corbyn Prime Minister. This is an election that's about security, safety, defence, borders, NATO, all the rest of it. You can't trust somebody who wanted to make Corbyn Prime Minister. Starmer's actually been helped by the fact that Corbyn is running as an independent, because that attack is pretty easily rebutted if you can say Jeremy Corbyn's literally in a different party now. He's not in our party.
Yeah.
He's running against us. So that makes it that more easy for them. Diane Abbott, again, serves as a reminder, the woman who would have been Home Secretary, whom Keir Starmer campaigned to make Home Secretary. So it's easier for Labour if she just goes away quietly.
I get the unspoken motive there. I suppose the bit which bothers me about the spoken motive is that Jess Phillips just pointed out that Liz Truss is going on the podcast of Carl Benjamin, known as Sargon of Akkad, like a far-right a podcaster. And it just seems like, I mean, she's obviously been with Steve Bannon, and you think the left-wing equivalent would be suspended. It just seems if you're Tory, you can sort of hang out with the far-right and it's fine. So I think that does create the sense of injustice, even if you say, I get the politics of it.
I don't think it is fine. I don't think it is fine. I think that actually Liz Truss's world tour of the far right is damaging for the Conservative Party and is damaging for centrist Conservative candidates who I have spoken to who go, well, she not just shut the fuck fuck up. And as we were talking about beforehand, it's damaging for Rishi Sunak as well. So the fact that Sunak hasn't been able to distance himself from his predecessor, and you could argue he should have kicked her out of the party for some of the stuff that she's been saying, he hasn't been able to do that because he's too weak and his management of the party isn't authoritative enough. Keir Starmer has been able to do that. That is a win for Starmer, as it were, or it would have been if they'd handled this very delicate matter better. And I think if it hadn't been for the leaks on Tuesday night, they could have stage managed Diane Abbott's dignified return as a Labour MP and then standing down in a much more elegant way where everyone was able to save face. So I really think what it comes down to is party management, and I would hope that Starmer's team are looking at whoever leaked that and giving them a bollocking, because it has caused way more problems for them than it needed to.
So moving on to Corbyn, who is running in my backyard, the whole issue is there of should he have been suspended for as long as he was? Is that commensurate with the offence or whatever? Well, that's all over now because he is running against Labour. What are his chances? I've seen lots of factional predictions. People who don't like Corbyn are convinced he will lose. People who do like Corbyn are convinced he will win handsomely. Is there any polling?
So I haven't seen polling, but I read a great piece by Ben Walker in the New Statesman, who is good on all these kind of things,
great.
and much better
good.
than me. But he basically said Corbyn does have a chance. But he said the thing about independent candidates is there's no blueprint for how well they do. They can get vote share from anywhere between 22% and 70% of the vote when they've stood back from the party. He points out that Corbyn will face practical issues in that he will no longer have the well-oiled Labour campaign machine behind him. And he also points to the North East mayoral contest where Jamie Driscoll ran against Labour, and despite having a high-profile campaign and polls having him ahead, he lost by 13 points because his team's door-knocking efforts just couldn't compete with that of the Labour Party. So there's stuff like that as well. But, you know, Corbyn is an incredibly high-profile independent candidate. He's former leader of the party, and he's going for it at a time where actually there are divisions in the party that he can take advantage of. So we know that there are splits in Labour vote over things like foreign policy, over things like the party abandoning some of its more kind of progressive pledges. So you could imagine Corbyn picking up some of the vote. Whether or not he would be able to win it, I think it's up for grabs. I mean, the other thing to say is that Labour's candidate, Praful Nargrand, has not really been seen very much as of yet, and he's very kind of the moderate end. I was reading a bit about him. He's getting quite a lot of heat on social media because he has shares. He's a multimillionaire and he has shares in a private healthcare company. So he's really kind of stoked a lot of ire from the left of the Labour Party. And he hasn't responded to many media requests for interviews. So Labour lists say they haven't heard from him. Some of the local papers say they haven't heard from him either. So in terms of him trying to build his campaign, it's so far been a little bit lackluster. So that could also give Corbyn a little bit of a lead.
Weird choice of candidate, I think.
In the Islington Tribune, it said, "Hello, is Praful there? It's total silence from the Labour hopeful eyeing up seat," in the headline in his local paper. So it's not great for the early days of your campaign.
It's absolute mayhem, though, because obviously the local Labour Party there generally is very pro-Corbyn, and now they have to choose between Labour and Corbyn. And then if they all get booted out, then the local Labour Party will become completely different, taken over by a different faction of the party. Momentum was a real pickle, wasn't it? Going, we're going to stay.
You're also going to have councillors who are going to have to decide whether they campaign for Corbyn as an independent and get expelled from the party.
I don't think he should have run. I mean, I understand why, but I just feel like it puts a lot of people who are very close to him in an incredibly painful position.
It's got too much of an ego not to run.
I think it is ego, and I think it is a bit of Corbynism's last stand. But that does, of course, mean that if he loses, then that looks more terrible than it needed to for that faction. Do they care? Does Labour care about losing the left? There's various talk, which includes not just the kind of the sort of boomer Corbynites, young voters. Talk about black voters around Diane Abbott, obviously Muslim voters around Gaza. Do you get the impression that Labour cares who they're losing?
So there's a short-term answer to that and there's a medium to long-term answer to that. For this election, one of the reasons Labour are expected to win is, but by so much, even with the massive swing that they need from 2019, is because their vote is looking really efficiently distributed, which is they are losing votes among core voters. They're losing votes in the inner cities, among young people, among Muslim communities. That is happening. However, those are all areas where they have such huge majorities, it doesn't matter. And they are gaining votes in marginals and other parts of the country, and obviously in Scotland as well, which is pretty massive. So does it matter for this election? No. Will it matter in future? Absolutely. Keir Starmer is talking openly about needing a decade of renewal. Everyone in Labour sort of understands that they're going to need 2 terms to fix this stuff. And my read of it is there is a bit of an arrogance around some of Starmer's Boys Club advisors, where they think they don't need the left now. And they're right, they don't need the left now, but they will need the left. And when you are in government, you have to make compromises constantly. You are going to constantly be pissing people off because you can't please everyone, and your support base is going to dwindle. It's going to chip away at the wide base of support that you have when you come in. So if you can avoid pissing people off unnecessarily, it's better to do that even if you don't need them now, because it kind of saves them for later when you do. And I am already hearing a bit of anxiety among people in Labour that they think that these early mistakes or antagonisms will cost Labour in 5 years' time, at a point where the party realises too late and can't go back and fix it.
Because I had various problems with Corbyn and his team, but
was he your local MP?
Yes,
he was my MP for 9 years.
He remains my local MP for now, and obviously I was rather critical of various parts of his leadership. But I have been a bit shocked by this kind of bully boy contempt for anyone on the left. Not just kind of like, anti-Semitic cranks, great, have contempt for them, but contempt for just sort of anybody that sort of says something a bit left-wing, which
I think the point that enabled them to kick Corbyn out of suspend the whip and keep it suspended is he refused to apologise. And the anti-Semitism scandal was this huge thing that happened while he was in charge of it. And there is a feeling, even among people more on the left, not in the Starmer camp, who think it was kind of his responsibility a little bit, and he could at least have tried to take responsibility and move on from that. And the failure to do that, even after the report came out, was more damaging to the party than it needed to be.
That thing you said about James Forsyth and Sunak, and basically there's somebody that just goes, no, mate, you're doing great. Like Corbyn has loads of people like that. Loads of people. He's just surrounded by people that when you did nothing wrong. And what really distresses me actually is the return of, it was a scam. And that there's something there's quite a dark thing coming back around the Islington North fight. Is there's some very justifiably cross and principled left-wing people. And then there's a lot of stuff that just reminds me of like the worst days. Just to finish off, Zoe, given all that we've been saying, were you surprised that Starmer was happy to describe himself as a progressive socialist the other day? I've been writing a bit about Blair and the 97 campaign. He had essentially banished the S word by the time of the campaign. And there's Starmer just coming out and saying it. And I thought it was quite interesting, given that he doesn't want to be associated with Corbynism at all.
I was a bit surprised, just because we haven't heard that very much from any of the kind of Labour front bench. So it was, but it does make sense, because we do compare Starmer and Blair a lot, but there are differences. And I think one of the key things is that Starmer actually is quite communitarian in his principles. There's also his team around him, his shadow cabinet. They're all kind of, they all have a story of social mobility. They all have a story of the community. They all tell it quite a lot. And Starmer talks a lot about towns and groups and people coming together in a way that I think Blair did a bit, but he was far more focused on, the kind of the role of business and social mobility in a slightly...
And individual freedom.
Yes, in a different way. So I do think, and I think maybe we have lost that because of all these comparisons between Starmer and Blair and the fact that there's been this big push on business. And I think Starmer kind of needed to remind people, and probably himself, that actually he is different and he does have these communitarian instincts that I think are going to be quite fundamental to what Starmerism is about.
I like the way he wasn't scared of the word. I thought that was just a nice sort of lack of caution on that. And that is the show. Thank you to Zoe.
Thank you.
And Rachel.
Thank you.
Hang around for the extra bit after Demon is a Monster by Corner Shop and a roll call of the generous supporters who keep us fighting fit for the election. You can join them for as little as £3 a month and you'll get the podcast early without ads plus lots more. And there's some live show news coming soon. Search Oh God What Now Patreon to find out how. We will see you next time.
Hello, and many thanks for your generosity to M. Handel, Hannah, Ian Phillips, James Riley and Ben Maiden.
Big shout out from me and thank you to contributing to the election fund to Michael Booth, Jenny Walker, Jodie Adams, Emma L and Richard Maltby.
And thanks from me to Beth K, Andrew W, KT and backers returning just in time for election fun, Katrina Moore and Charlotte Yates.